Marcus Williams walked through the crowded shopping mall with his head down, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed him wherever he went. At 28 years old, he had grown used to the reactions his appearance caused. The intricate tattoo covering the entire left side of his face drew attention wherever he went, and most of that attention was negative. The tattoo was unlike anything most people had ever seen. It wasn't the typical skull, dragon, or tribal design that many associated with face tattoos. Instead, it was an elaborate military insignia, intertwined with coordinates, dates, and symbols that held deep meaning for Marcus. But to the average person walking by, it simply looked like the mark of someone who had made poor life choices. "Look at that freak," whispered a middle-aged woman to her friend as they passed by. "What kind of person ruins their face like that?" Her friend shook her head in disgust. "Probably some gang member or criminal. People like that shouldn't be allowed in public places." Marcus pretended not to hear their words, but each comment cut deep. He pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes and quickened his pace toward the exit. This was exactly why he preferred to do his shopping late at night or in small towns where fewer people would notice him. As he approached the food court, a group of teenagers spotted him and started laughing loudly. One of them pulled out his phone and began recording. "Hey everyone, check out this loser," the teenager called out to his friends. "Who wants to bet he's been to prison?" His friends joined in the mockery, making exaggerated gang signs and pretending to be tough. Their laughter echoed through the food court, drawing even more attention to Marcus. Several other shoppers stopped to watch the spectacle, some shaking their heads in disapproval at Marcus, others pulling their children closer as if he posed some kind of threat. Marcus felt his face burn with shame and anger. He wanted to tell them they were wrong, that the tattoo represented honor and sacrifice, not crime or violence. He wanted to explain what each symbol meant and why he had chosen to wear his story on his face. But he knew they wouldn't listen. They had already made up their minds about who he was based on his appearance. A security guard approached, eyeing Marcus suspiciously. "Sir, is there a problem here?" The teenagers immediately pointed at Marcus. "He was staring at us weird," one of them lied. "Made us feel uncomfortable." The security guard looked Marcus up and down, taking in the facial tattoo and drawing his own conclusions. "I'm going to have to ask you to move along, sir. We don't want any trouble here." Marcus knew there was no point in arguing. This wasn't the first time he had been asked to leave a public place simply because of how he looked. He nodded silently and turned to walk away, the laughter and comments following him as he left. The drive home was filled with familiar thoughts of regret and isolation. Marcus lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the judgmental eyes of society. He had learned to be self-sufficient because employment was nearly impossible with his appearance. Most employers took one look at him and immediately dismissed him as unemployable. He had tried covering the tattoo with makeup for job interviews, but it was too large and detailed to hide completely. The few jobs he had managed to get were always short-lived. Coworkers would complain, customers would refuse to be served by him, or employers would find excuses to let him go. As he sat in his apartment that evening, Marcus looked at himself in the mirror and traced the lines of the tattoo with his finger. Each element told a piece of his story, a story that no one cared to hear. The coordinates marked the location where his unit had been ambushed. The dates commemorated fallen brothers who would never come home. The symbols represented missions that had saved countless lives but cost him everything. Marcus had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan as part of an elite special operations unit. He had been decorated for valor, had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, and had completed missions that remained classified to this day. But none of that mattered now. All people saw was a face tattoo and the assumptions that came with it. The tattoo itself had been done by a fellow veteran who understood the significance of each element. It was meant to be a tribute, a way of carrying his fallen brothers with him always. In the military community where it was created, it was respected and understood. But in civilian life, it had become a curse that isolated him from society. Marcus had tried to explain the meaning to people before, but their minds were already made up. To them, anyone who would tattoo their face was clearly someone to be feared or avoided. They couldn't see past the ink to the man beneath, couldn't understand that sometimes the most painful experiences leave marks that can't be hidden. He opened his laptop and scrolled through job listings, knowing that most would be closed to him before he even applied. The few that might consider him were usually manual labor positions where he could work alone or wear protective gear that covered his face. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he was serving his country, but it was the reality he faced every day. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Marcus had no family left, and making friends was nearly impossible when people judged him, before he could even introduce himself. He spent most of his time alone, reading, exercising, and trying to find purpose in a world that seemed determined to reject him. Sometimes he wondered if he should have the tattoo removed, but laser removal would take years and cost more money than he could afford. Besides, removing it would feel like betraying the memory of the men it honored. The tattoo was a part of him now, for better or worse, and he had to find a way to live with the consequences of that choice. As the night grew late, Marcus prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same challenges, more stares, more whispers, more assumptions about who he was based solely on his appearance. He had learned to expect nothing different, but somewhere deep inside he still hoped that one day someone would look past the tattoo and see the truth of who he really was. The next morning brought another challenge for Marcus. His landlord had called to inform him that several tenants in the building had complained about his presence. They claimed he was making them feel unsafe, despite the fact that Marcus had never spoken to any of them or caused any problems. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, had been apologetic but firm. "Look, Marcus, I don't have anything personal against you," Peterson had said over the phone, "but I'm running a business here, and if tenants start moving out because they're uncomfortable, I could lose a lot of money. I'm going to have to ask you to find somewhere else to live by the end of the month." Marcus had expected this day would come eventually. It always did. He had moved 7 times in the past 3 years, always for the same reason. His appearance made people nervous, and nervous people complained to landlords, employers, and anyone else who would listen. He spent the morning looking at apartment listings online, but his options were limited. Most landlords wanted to meet potential tenants in person, and once they saw his face tattoo, they would suddenly remember that the apartment had already been rented to someone else. The few places that might accept him were usually in dangerous neighborhoods or rundown buildings with serious problems. Around noon, Marcus decided to take a walk to clear his head. He chose a route through the quieter residential area of town, hoping to avoid the crowds and the stares. The tree-lined streets were peaceful, and for a few moments he could almost forget about his troubles. As he walked past a small park, he heard shouting and commotion coming from the playground area. A group of older boys, probably around 16 or 17 years old, had surrounded a much smaller child who couldn't have been more than 10. The little boy was crying and trying to protect a backpack that the older boys were attempting to take from him. "Give us your lunch money, Squirt," one of the bullies demanded. "We know your mom packs extra cash in there." The child shook his head frantically. "Please don't take it. My mom gave me money for a school field trip. If I lose it, I can't go." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest. He had always hated bullies, and seeing a child being tormented brought back memories of his own difficult childhood. Without thinking about the consequences, he walked quickly toward the group. "Hey," Marcus called out in a firm voice, "leave the kid alone." The bullies turned to look at him, and their expressions immediately changed when they saw his face tattoo. Instead of being intimidated, however, they seemed to find his appearance amusing. "Oh, look, guys," the leader of the group laughed. "The circus freak wants to play hero." His friends joined in the laughter. "What are you going to do, scary face? Call your gang friends?" Marcus ignored their taunts and stepped closer. "I said leave him alone. Find someone your own size to pick on." The bullies exchanged glances, clearly trying to decide whether to back down or escalate the situation. The leader, emboldened by his friend's presence, decided to stand his ground. "Why don't you mind your own business, freak?" he sneered. "This doesn't concern you." Before Marcus could respond, one of the other boys pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is going to be hilarious," he said. "Wait until everyone at school sees this video of the tattooed weirdo trying to be tough." Marcus realized that no matter what he did, he would be painted as the villain in this situation. If he walked away, the child would continue to be bullied. If he intervened more forcefully, the video would make him look like an aggressive criminal picking on teenagers. But looking at the frightened face of the little boy, he knew he couldn't just walk away. "You have 10 seconds to apologize to this kid and walk away," Marcus said calmly, "or I'm calling the police and your parents." The bullies laughed even harder. "The police?" the leader mocked. They'll probably arrest you just for looking like that. Nobody's going to believe anything you say." Unfortunately, Marcus knew they were probably right. His appearance worked against him in every situation, especially when it came to authority figures. But he also knew he couldn't let these boys continue to terrorize a child. Just as the situation seemed about to escalate further, an elderly woman approached from across the park. She was walking a small dog and had clearly witnessed the entire confrontation. "What's going on here?" she demanded, looking directly at the group of teenagers. The leader immediately changed his tone. "Nothing, ma'am. We were just talking to our friend here." The elderly woman wasn't fooled. She looked at the crying child and then at Marcus, who was standing protectively in front of the boy. "It looks to me like you boys were bullying this child," she said firmly. "And this gentleman was trying to help him." Marcus was surprised. Most adults would have taken one look at his tattoo and assumed he was the problem. But this woman seemed to understand the real situation. The bullies realized they had lost the advantage with a witness present. "We weren't doing anything wrong," one of them protested weakly. "Then you won't mind if I call your parents and the school to discuss your behavior?" the woman replied, pulling out her phone. "I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about this." The teenagers quickly gathered their things and started to leave, but not before the leader turned back to Marcus with a threatening look. "This isn't over. Freak," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We know where to find you." After the bullies left, the elderly woman turned to Marcus with a kind smile. "Thank you for standing up for Tommy here. It takes courage to do the right thing, especially when you know people might judge you for it." Marcus was taken aback by her words. He knelt down to check on the little boy who was still clutching his backpack tightly. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked gently. "Did they hurt you?" Tommy shook his head, wiping away his tears. "Thank you for helping me. Those boys take my money every week, but I was too scared to tell anyone." The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, explained that she had seen the bullying happening for weeks but hadn't been able to intervene effectively due to her age. She thanked Marcus repeatedly for his bravery and insisted on walking Tommy home to make sure he arrived safely. As they walked together, Mrs. Henderson chatted with Marcus as if his appearance was completely normal. She asked about his background and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like someone was seeing him as a person, rather than just a face tattoo. When they reached Tommy's house, the boy's mother came to the door. Mrs. Henderson explained what had happened, praising Marcus for his intervention. Tommy's mother was initially startled by Marcus's appearance, but after hearing the story, she thanked him sincerely and invited him to stay for coffee. Marcus politely declined, not wanting to overstay his welcome, but the encounter had lifted his spirits considerably. As he walked home, he reflected on how different the situation could have been if Mrs. Henderson hadn't appeared. It reminded him that there were still good people in the world, even if they were sometimes hard to find. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the park, and Marcus found himself thinking often about Mrs. Henderson and young Tommy. The encounter had been a rare bright spot in his otherwise difficult life, but it had also made his current situation feel even more isolating by comparison. He was still searching for a new apartment, and had been turned down by 6 different landlords in the past week alone. Marcus had managed to find temporary work at a construction site on the outskirts of town. The job required him to wear a hard hat and safety gear that partially obscured his face, which made it easier for his co-workers to tolerate his presence. The work was physically demanding, but Marcus was grateful for the income and the distraction it provided. The construction crew was a rough group of men who had initially been suspicious of Marcus, but they had grudgingly accepted him when it became clear that he was a skilled worker who kept to himself. They didn't invite him to join their conversations during breaks, and they certainly didn't socialize with him after work. But they had stopped making openly hostile comments about his appearance. On this particular Friday afternoon, the crew was working on the foundation for a new office building when Marcus noticed a black sedan pull up to the construction site. 2 men in expensive suits got out of the car and began talking to the foreman. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation from where he was working, but he could see them pointing in his direction. His heart sank. This was a familiar pattern. Someone would call in a complaint about his appearance, claiming they felt threatened or uncomfortable. The authorities or management would investigate, and Marcus would inevitably lose his job. He had hoped that working at a construction site would be different, but apparently nowhere was safe from the prejudice that followed him. The foreman, a gruff man named Bill Henderson, walked over to where Marcus was working. Marcus braced himself for the conversation he had heard so many times before. "Williams," Bill called out, "those men want to talk to you." Marcus set down his tools and walked slowly toward the two suited men, his mind already racing through his limited options for finding new employment. As he approached, he could see that both men were studying his face intently, paying particular attention to his tattoo. "Are you Marcus Williams?" the taller of the two men asked. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, keeping his voice respectful. "Is there a problem?" The men exchanged a look before the shorter one spoke. "We're from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We've been trying to locate you for several months." Marcus was confused. He had never applied for VA benefits or services. After his discharge from the military, he had tried to distance himself from anything related to his service, partly because the memories were too painful, and partly because he felt that the system had failed him when he needed it most. "I think you have the wrong person," Marcus said. "I haven't had any contact with the VA." The taller man pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a photograph on the screen. It was a military photo of Marcus from several years ago, before the tattoo, looking young and proud in his dress uniform. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, Special Operations, 3 tours in Afghanistan, Purple Heart recipient, Silver Star recipient, the man read from the tablet. "Is this you?" Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't heard his military rank or those honors mentioned in years. In his current life, he was just another face-tattooed outcast that society preferred to ignore. "That was a long time ago," Marcus said quietly. "What does the VA want with me?" The shorter man stepped forward. "There's been a development regarding your service record. Specifically, there's an error that needs to be corrected. We need you to come with us to the regional VA office to discuss the matter." Marcus hesitated. His experiences with bureaucracy had not been positive since leaving the military, and he was naturally suspicious of any official attention. But something in the men's manner suggested that this was important. Bill Henderson, who had been listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Wait a minute. Did you say Purple Heart and Silver Star? Marcus, you never mentioned you were a decorated veteran." The construction crew had gathered around, and Marcus could see the expressions on their faces changing from curiosity to something approaching respect. He had never told them about his military service because he assumed they wouldn't believe him or wouldn't care. "Like I said, that was a long time ago," Marcus repeated, uncomfortable with the attention. One of the VA officials seemed to sense his reluctance. "Mr. Williams, I understand your hesitation, but this matter involves a significant error in your service record that has prevented you from receiving benefits you're entitled to. There's also the matter of a commendation that was never properly processed." Marcus felt his world shifting. For years he had believed that his military service was in the past, that those honors meant nothing in civilian life. The idea that there might be benefits or recognition he had never received was almost too much to process. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "I received my discharge papers. Everything was supposed to be final." The taller official pulled up another screen on his tablet. "There was a clerical error that resulted in your file being misfiled for several years. When we finally located it during a recent audit, we discovered that you were never properly debriefed after your final mission, and there were recommendations for additional honors that were never processed." Marcus felt his hands beginning to shake. His final mission had been the one that had cost him everything. It was the mission that had resulted in the death of 3 of his closest friends. The mission that had left him with injuries both physical and psychological. The mission that had inspired him to get the facial tattoo as a memorial to his fallen brothers. "That mission is classified," Marcus said. "I can't discuss it." "We're not asking you to discuss classified details," the shorter official assured him. "But we need you to come with us so that we can properly complete your service record and ensure you receive everything you're entitled to." The construction crew was staring at Marcus with new eyes. Bill Henderson, who had barely acknowledged Marcus's existence for the past 2 weeks, suddenly seemed to see him differently. "Marcus," Bill said, "if these men are telling the truth, you should go with them. A Silver Star doesn't get handed out for nothing. That's serious business." Marcus looked around at the faces of his co-workers, seeing respect where there had only been tolerance before. But he also knew that respect based on military honors was fragile. If they knew the full story of why he had left the service, if they understood the pain and trauma that had driven him to mark his face permanently, their respect might quickly turn back to judgment. "I need to think about this," Marcus said finally. The VA officials exchanged another look. "Mr. Williams, we understand that this is unexpected, but there are time-sensitive matters involved. We really need you to come with us today." Marcus felt trapped between his past and his present. The military life represented both his greatest achievements and his deepest wounds. He had spent years trying to forget that part of himself, but now it seemed that part of his life wasn't ready to forget him. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right, let me get my things." As Marcus gathered his tools and told Bill that he would need to leave for the day, he could feel the weight of his co-workers' stares. For the first time since getting his tattoo, people were looking at him with something other than fear or disgust. But Marcus wasn't sure if this new attention would be any easier to bear than the old prejudice. The drive to the VA regional office was conducted in relative silence. Marcus sat in the back seat of the government sedan, watching familiar landmarks pass by through the tinted windows. The two officials, who had introduced themselves as Mr. Carson and Mr. Mitchell, made occasional small talk about the weather and traffic, but seemed to understand that Marcus needed time to process what was happening. The regional VA office was a modern building that Marcus had driven past many times, but never entered. As they walked through the main entrance, he noticed several veterans in various stages of their own bureaucratic journeys. Some were young, recent returnees from current conflicts, while others were elderly men whose service dated back decades. All of them looked tired and frustrated with the system they were navigating. Mr. Carson led Marcus to a small conference room on the third floor, while Mr. Mitchell went to retrieve what he called the files. The room was sterile and impersonal, with government-issued furniture and motivational posters about veteran services that felt hollow to Marcus after years of being ignored by those same services. "Can I get you some coffee or water?" Mr. Carson asked, settling into a chair across from Marcus. Marcus declined the offer and sat quietly, his hands folded on the table. The tattoo on his face felt more prominent than usual in the fluorescent lighting of the office, and he was acutely aware of how out of place he must look in this official setting. Mr. Mitchell returned, carrying a thick manila folder and a laptop computer. He set both items on the table and opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be years of military documents and correspondence. "Mr. Williams," Mr. Mitchell began, "what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear, but it's important that you understand the full scope of the situation." Marcus nodded, steeling himself for whatever revelation was coming. "After your final mission in Afghanistan, your commanding officer submitted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor." Mr. Mitchell continued. "However, due to the classified nature of the operation and a series of administrative errors, that recommendation was never properly reviewed." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration, reserved for acts of valor that went far beyond the call of duty. He had never even dreamed that such recognition had been considered for his actions. "That's impossible," Marcus said quietly. "My CO never mentioned anything about that level of commendation." Mr. Carson opened the laptop and turned it toward Marcus. "Your commanding officer was Colonel James Patterson. Unfortunately, Colonel Patterson was killed in action 3 weeks after filing the recommendation. The paperwork was misfiled during the chaos that followed, and your case fell through the cracks." Marcus stared at the screen, which showed a digitized copy of the original recommendation letter. He could see Colonel Patterson's signature at the bottom, and reading the description of his actions during that final mission brought back memories he had tried for years to suppress. The mission had been a rescue operation to extract a team of intelligence officers who had been captured by enemy forces. Marcus and his unit had been inserted deep behind enemy lines with orders to locate and retrieve the captured personnel. What they had found was a heavily fortified compound with more than 50 enemy combatants. The original plan had called for a coordinated assault with air support, but when intelligence indicated that the captured officers were going to be executed within hours, Marcus had made the decision to infiltrate the compound alone. He had successfully located the prisoners and was leading them to the extraction point when they were discovered. What followed was a running firefight through hostile territory that lasted for more than 6 hours. Marcus had single-handedly held off enemy forces while coordinating the evacuation of the rescued officers. In the process, he had been wounded multiple times and had seen 3 of his closest friends killed while providing covering fire. According to the after-action reports, Mr. Mitchell said, "Your actions saved the lives of 7 intelligence officers and prevented sensitive information from falling into enemy hands. The mission was considered a strategic success despite the casualties." Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the faces of the men who had died that day. Their deaths had haunted him every day since, and the facial tattoo he wore was his way of ensuring he would never forget their sacrifice. "The men who died deserved the recognition more than I did," Marcus said. "I was just doing my job." "That's not how your commanding officer saw it," Mr. Carson replied. "According to his report, you displayed extraordinary heroism and leadership under fire. He specifically noted that you refused to abandon the mission even when offered multiple opportunities to withdraw." Mr. Mitchell pulled out another set of documents. "There's more, Mr. Williams. Due to the administrative errors, you were never properly compensated for the injuries you sustained during that mission. You're entitled to significant disability benefits and back pay dating from your discharge." Marcus had been living in poverty for years, struggling to find work and housing because of his appearance. The idea that he had been entitled to financial support all this time was almost incomprehensible. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "Including back pay, disability compensation, and accumulated interest." "Approximately $450,000, Mr. Mitchell said matter-of-factly. Marcus felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Nearly $500,000 would change everything about his life. He could afford proper housing, maybe even start a business or go back to school. Most importantly, he wouldn't have to worry about basic survival anymore. "Why now?" Marcus asked. "Why are you telling me this now after all these years?" Mr. Carson leaned forward. "There's been a push to review cases that may have been mishandled during the drawdown period. Your case was one of several that were flagged for investigation. When we realized the scope of the errors, we made locating you a priority. We also discovered something else," Mr. Mitchell added. "Your story has come to the attention of some very senior military officials. There's going to be a ceremony next month to formally present you with the Medal of Honor." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand. I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to serve my country and bring my men home. Sometimes the most deserving recipients are the ones who don't seek recognition," Mr. Carson said. "Your actions spoke louder than any words could." The 2 officials spent the next hour walking Marcus through the paperwork required to process his benefits and arrange for the medal ceremony. They assured him that the financial compensation would be expedited and that he should see the first payments within a few weeks. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Mitchell handed Marcus a business card. "There's one more thing, Mr. Williams. The ceremony is going to be a significant event. There will be media coverage and your story is going to become public. You should be prepared for that level of attention." Marcus looked down at his hands, thinking about what public attention would mean for someone with his appearance. He had spent years hiding from society, and the thought of being thrust into the spotlight was terrifying. "Can I decline the ceremony?" Marcus asked. "Technically, yes," Mr. Carson replied, "but I would encourage you to accept. Your story could inspire other veterans who are struggling. Sometimes people need to see that heroes come in all forms." As Marcus left the VA office that afternoon, his head was spinning with everything he had learned. The financial security was life-changing, but the recognition felt overwhelming. He had worn his pain and loss on his face for years, believing that society would never understand his sacrifice. Now he was being told that his service had been extraordinary, that his actions had saved lives and served his country with distinction. The drive back to his apartment gave him time to think about what this all meant. For the first time in years, he had hope for a different future, but he also wondered if he was ready to step out of the shadows and claim the recognition that had been denied to him for so long. Word traveled fast through the small construction crew, and by Monday morning everyone on the job site knew that Marcus was a decorated war hero. The change in how his coworkers treated him was immediate and dramatic. Men who had barely acknowledged his existence were now going out of their way to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Bill Henderson pulled Marcus aside during the morning break. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. If I had known about your service record, I would have treated you with the respect you deserve from day one." Marcus appreciated the sentiment. but it also highlighted something that had been bothering him since the meeting at the VA office. People were suddenly seeing him as worthy of respect because of his military honors, but his character hadn't changed overnight. He was the same person who had helped young Tommy in the park and had worked hard at every job, despite facing constant discrimination. "I'm the same person I was last week," Marcus said quietly. "The only thing that's changed is what you know about me." Bill looked uncomfortable with the implication. "Well, yes, but knowing that you're a war hero puts everything in perspective. That tattoo on your face, it's not what I thought it was, is it?" Marcus touched his face unconsciously. "No, it's not a gang tattoo or a sign of poor judgment. It's a memorial to the men who died saving those hostages. Every symbol, every date, every detail represents something important to me." For the first time, Bill really looked at the tattoo instead of just seeing it as a disfigurement. "Would you tell me about it?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. He had never explained the tattoo to anyone outside of the military community. But something in Bill's tone suggested genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity. "The coordinates here," Marcus said, pointing to numbers integrated into the design, "mark the location where we were ambushed. These dates are when each of my friends died. The eagle represents the unit we served in, and these symbols are recognition badges they earned but never got to receive." Bill listened intently, his expression growing more serious as Marcus explained each element. "So this whole time you've been carrying their memory with you?" "Every day," Marcus confirmed. "People see it as a sign that I'm dangerous or unstable, but to me, it's a promise that I'll never forget their sacrifice." News of Marcus's Medal of Honor recommendation had somehow leaked beyond the construction site. By Tuesday, a local newspaper reporter had tracked him down and was asking for an interview. Marcus politely declined, but the reporter's questions made it clear that his story was becoming public whether he wanted it to or not. The article appeared in the Thursday edition of the local paper with the headline "Local, War Hero Hidden in Plain Sight." The story detailed Marcus's military service and the administrative errors that had prevented him from receiving proper recognition. It also included a photo of him at the construction site, his facial tattoo clearly visible. The response to the article was immediate and divided. Some readers were outraged that a Medal of Honor recipient had been living in poverty and facing discrimination. Others questioned whether someone with a facial tattoo could truly represent the values of military service. The newspaper's online comments section became a battlefield of opinions about appearance, service, and what it meant to be a hero. Marcus found himself at the center of a controversy he had never wanted. Supporters began reaching out to express their admiration and offer assistance. Veterans organizations invited him to speak at events. Local businesses offered him jobs and discounts. But there were also critics who questioned his judgment and suggested that his appearance undermined the dignity of military honors. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent years trying to remain invisible. Marcus found himself unable to go anywhere without being recognized and approached by strangers who wanted to thank him, criticize him, or simply stare at the man who had become a local celebrity. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from the park, appeared at his apartment door one afternoon carrying a homemade apple pie. "I saw the article in the paper," she said with a warm smile. "I wanted you to know how proud I am to have met you." "You were kind to me before you knew about any of this," Marcus replied, accepting the pie gratefully. "That meant more to me than you'll ever know." "I could tell you were a good man from how you helped Tommy," Mrs. Henderson said. "Military honors don't make someone a hero. They just recognize the heroism that was already there." The Medal of Honor ceremony was scheduled for the following month, at a military base 3 hours away. The VA officials had warned Marcus that it would be a significant event with media coverage and military dignitaries in attendance. As the date approached, Marcus felt increasingly anxious about the public attention. He had received dozens of interview requests from newspapers, magazines, and television stations. Everyone wanted to tell the story of the tattooed war hero who had been overlooked by the system. Marcus declined most of the requests, but the media attention continued to grow. One evening, as Marcus was leaving a grocery store, he was approached by a young man in his early 20s who was clearly struggling with some kind of disability. The man walked with a pronounced limp and had visible scars on his arms. "Excuse me, are you Marcus Williams?" the young man asked nervously. Marcus nodded, bracing himself for another uncomfortable encounter with a stranger. "My name is David Rodriguez," the young man said, extending his hand. "I'm a veteran too. I served in Iraq before I got injured by an IED." Marcus shook David's hand, noticing the firm grip despite the man's obvious physical challenges. "I read about you in the paper," David continued, "and I wanted to thank you for something that might sound strange." Marcus waited for him to continue, curious about what this young veteran wanted to say. "For 3 years, I've been hiding from the world because of my scars and my limp," David explained. "I felt like people saw me as broken, damaged goods. I was ashamed of how I looked after my injuries." Marcus understood that feeling all too well. The visible marks of trauma, whether physical or chosen, made people uncomfortable and led to assumptions about character and worth. But seeing your story, seeing how you've carried your service and your loss so openly, it made me realize something, David said. "Maybe the problem isn't with how we look. Maybe the problem is with people who can't see past appearances to understand what we've been through." Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. This was exactly the kind of conversation he had hoped to avoid, but David's words resonated deeply with his own experience. "You've inspired me to stop hiding," David said. "I'm going back to school next month, and I'm going to apply for a job with the VA to help other veterans. If a Medal of Honor recipient can face the world with his story written on his face, then I can face it with my scars." After David left, Marcus sat in his car for a long time thinking about their conversation. For years he had viewed his tattoo as a burden that isolated him from society. He had never considered that his willingness to wear his story so visibly might inspire others who were struggling with their own visible and invisible wounds. The realization that his experience could help other veterans gave Marcus a new perspective on the upcoming ceremony. Maybe the public attention wasn't just about him receiving overdue recognition. Maybe it was about showing other veterans that they didn't have to hide their service or their struggles. That night, Marcus called the VA officials and told them he was ready to participate fully in the Medal of Honor ceremony. He also agreed to do one television interview before the event, with the condition that he could use the platform to talk about veteran services and the importance of looking beyond appearances when judging others. The interview was scheduled for the following week with a national news program that specialized in human interest stories. Marcus spent several days preparing, thinking about what message he wanted to convey and how he could honor the memory of his fallen friends while also helping other veterans who might be watching. As word spread that Marcus had agreed to do the interview, the local community's response intensified. The construction company where he worked announced that they were promoting him to a supervisory position and implementing new policies about veteran hiring. Several other local businesses followed suit, launching initiatives to support veteran employment regardless of appearance or visible disabilities. But not all the attention was positive. Marcus received angry letters from people who felt that someone with a facial tattoo shouldn't represent military values. Some critics argued that his choice to permanently mark his face showed poor judgment that was incompatible with military honor. These criticisms stung, but they also reinforced Marcus's understanding of why he had faced so much discrimination. Society was quick to judge based on appearance and slow to look deeper at character and actions. The controversy surrounding his recognition highlighted the very prejudices that had made his post-military life so difficult. The night before the television interview, Marcus stood in front of his bathroom mirror and traced the lines of his tattoo one more time. Each element still carried the same meaning it had when he first got it. The coordinates, the dates, the symbols, they all represented sacrifice, loss, and remembrance. But now the tattoo represented something more. It had become a symbol of resilience, of refusing to hide from judgment and of carrying difficult truths openly rather than pretending they didn't exist. Marcus realized that his willingness to wear his story on his face had always been an act of courage, even when he didn't feel courageous. Tomorrow he would tell that story to a national audience. He would explain what the tattoo meant, why he had chosen to get it, and how society's reaction to it had shaped his life after military service. Most importantly, he would use his platform to advocate for other veterans who were struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. For the first time since getting the tattoo, Marcus felt truly proud of his decision to wear his service and his loss so visibly. The criticism and judgment he had faced were painful, but they had also revealed important truths about how society treated its veterans. Now he had the opportunity to use his experience to create positive change for others who had served their country with honor. The television studio was brighter and more intimidating than Marcus had expected. As the makeup artist worked around his facial tattoo, trying to reduce glare from the studio lights without covering the meaningful artwork, Marcus fought to calm his nerves. This would be his first time telling his story to a national audience, and the weight of that responsibility felt enormous. The interviewer, Sarah Chen, was a veteran journalist known for her thoughtful approach to military stories. She had spent an hour before the cameras rolled talking with Marcus about his service and the meaning behind his tattoo, putting him at ease with her genuine understanding of veteran issues. "Remember," Sarah said as they prepared to begin filming, "this is your opportunity to tell your story in your own words. Take your time and don't worry about being perfect." As the cameras began rolling, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. For years, he had imagined what it would be like to explain his tattoo to people who would actually listen. Now he finally had that chance. "Marcus," Sarah began, "you served 3 tours in Afghanistan with Special Operations Forces. Can you tell us about the mission that changed your life?" Marcus took a deep breath and began to tell the story he had carried alone for so many years. He described the rescue mission, the firefight that lasted for hours, and the friends who had died ensuring that captured intelligence officers could return home to their families. "The tattoo on your face tells that story, doesn't it?" Sarah asked gently. "Every element of it," Marcus confirmed, turning his head so the camera could capture the intricate details. "These coordinates mark where we were ambushed. These dates commemorate when each of my brothers fell. This eagle represents our unit, and these symbols are honors they earned but never lived to receive. You chose to put this memorial on your face, where everyone would see it. Why was that important to you?" Marcus had thought about this question countless times over the years. "I needed to carry them with me always," he said. "These men died heroes, but the mission was classified. Their families couldn't be told the full story of their sacrifice. I wanted to make sure that somewhere, someone would remember them every day." Sarah nodded with understanding. "But that choice has come with a significant cost. You faced discrimination, unemployment, housing issues. Do you regret the decision?" "Never," Marcus said firmly. "The discrimination I faced has been painful, but it's also revealed something important about how our society treats people who look different. If I had hidden my story, I might have had an easier life, but I would have betrayed the memory of my friends." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus discussing his struggles to find work, the loneliness of being judged by his appearance, and his surprise at learning about the Medal of Honor recommendation. Sarah skillfully guided the conversation to highlight both Marcus's personal journey and the broader issues facing veterans who return home with visible and invisible wounds. "What would you want people to understand about veterans like yourself?" Sarah asked as the interview neared its end. Marcus looked directly into the camera. "We all carry our service differently. Some veterans look exactly like what people expect a hero to look like. Others, like me, carry our stories in ways that make people uncomfortable. But the worth of our service isn't determined by how well we fit society's expectations of what a veteran should be." He paused, thinking about David Rodriguez and the other veterans he had met, who were struggling with their own transitions. If you see a veteran who looks different, who has visible scars or tattoos or disabilities, don't assume they're damaged or dangerous. They might be carrying stories of incredible courage and sacrifice. They might be the very people who ensured your freedom and safety. The interview aired 3 days later during prime time, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The network's website crashed from the volume of traffic as people shared the story across social media platforms. Veterans organizations reported thousands of new calls from people seeking help or offering support. Marcus's phone rang constantly with interview requests, job offers, and messages from veterans who had been inspired by his story. But the call that meant the most came from Tommy's mother, the little boy Marcus had helped in the park weeks earlier. "Mr. Williams," she said, "Tommy and I watched your interview together. He wanted me to call and tell you that he thinks you're the bravest person he's ever met. He said that anyone who would put their friends' names on their face to remember them must love them very much." The simple wisdom of a child's perspective brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Tommy had understood instinctively what many adults struggled to grasp, that the tattoo was an act of love and remembrance. not rebellion or poor judgment. In the days following the interview, Marcus began receiving letters from people across the country. Many were from veterans sharing their own struggles with discrimination and social acceptance. Others came from family members of fallen service members, thanking him for honoring the memory of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. One letter that particularly moved Marcus came from the widow of one of his fallen brothers. She had seen the interview and wanted to thank him for keeping her husband's memory alive in such a visible way. She included a photograph of her husband that Marcus had never seen before, showing him laughing with other members of their unit during a rare moment of levity during their deployment. The Medal of Honor ceremony was now just a week away, and the media attention surrounding it had grown beyond anything Marcus had imagined. The president would be presenting the medal personally, and veterans from across the country were planning to attend the ceremony to show their support. Marcus had initially worried that his appearance would overshadow the solemnity of the occasion, but the response to his interview had shown him that his story resonated with people precisely because he looked different from what they expected. His willingness to wear his service and sacrifice so openly had touched something deep in the national consciousness about honor, remembrance, and the true meaning of heroism. The construction crew had been given the day off to attend the ceremony, and Bill Henderson had organized a bus to transport anyone who wanted to make the trip. Local veterans organizations were coordinating their own travel plans, and the base commander had warned Marcus that the ceremony might be one of the largest Medal of Honor presentations in recent history, as Marcus prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most significant day of his life since leaving the military. He reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The same tattoo that had made him an outcast had now made him a symbol of courage and remembrance. The story he had carried alone for years was now inspiring others to share their own struggles and triumphs. But most importantly, the friends whose memory he carried on his face were finally receiving the recognition they deserved. Their sacrifice was being honored not just in a classified military file, but in the hearts and minds of people across the country who had heard their story and understood its significance. Marcus knew that the ceremony would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where he would be expected to speak for veterans who had been overlooked or marginalized. It was a responsibility he had never sought, but one he was now ready to embrace with the same courage that had carried him through that final mission so many years ago. The morning of the Medal of Honor ceremony dawned clear and crisp. Marcus stood in his hotel room, adjusting his dress uniform for the first time in years. The blue fabric felt foreign against his skin, but the weight of his service ribbons and badges brought back memories of pride and purpose that he had almost forgotten. He looked at himself in the mirror, seeing both the young soldier he had once been and the weathered veteran he had become. The facial tattoo that had defined his civilian life seemed different now, no longer a mark of shame or defiance, but a testament to love and remembrance that perfectly complemented the military honors on his chest. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mr. Carson from the VA, accompanied by a Navy SEAL commander named Robert Hayes. Commander Hayes was the imposing figure with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in special operations. "Mr. Williams," Commander Hayes said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you. I've read the classified reports of your final mission. What you did that day was extraordinary." Marcus shook the commander's hand, surprised by the genuine respect in his voice. "I was just doing my job, sir. My team did the real heroic work." Commander Hayes studied Marcus's face for a moment, his eyes taking in every detail of the tattoo. Instead of the judgment or curiosity Marcus usually encountered, he saw recognition and understanding. "That's a beautiful memorial," Commander Hayes said quietly. "I can see the unit insignia, the coordinates, the dates. You've honored your fallen brothers in a way that ensures they'll never be forgotten." For the first time since getting the tattoo, Marcus felt truly understood by someone in authority. Commander Hayes wasn't seeing a disfigured civilian or a poor decision. He was seeing exactly what Marcus had intended, a permanent tribute to sacrifice and brotherhood. "I lost men too," Commander Hayes continued. "I carry their dog tags, but what you've done is something more. You've made their memory part of who you are, visible to the world every day." The ceremony was held in the base's main auditorium, which had been decorated with flags and filled with hundreds of attendees. Marcus was amazed to see how many people had come to witness the event. The front rows were reserved for military dignitaries and Medal of Honor recipients, but behind them sat veterans from every branch of service, their families, and civilians who had been moved by Marcus's story. As Marcus was escorted to his seat on the stage, he spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Henderson was there with young Tommy, both beaming with pride. Bill Henderson and the entire construction crew occupied a section near the middle, wearing their best clothes and looking more formal than Marcus had ever seen them. David Rodriguez, the young veteran Marcus had met outside the grocery store, was seated with other disabled veterans, his expression one of pure inspiration. The ceremony began with the national anthem, sung by a military choir whose voices filled the auditorium with soaring harmonies. As Marcus stood at attention, hand over his heart, he felt the presence of his fallen brothers with him. This moment was as much theirs as it was his. The president took the podium to deliver remarks about service, sacrifice, and the meaning of heroism. His words were eloquent and moving, but what struck Marcus most was when the president looked directly at him and spoke about courage taking many forms. Staff Sergeant Williams carries the story of his service and sacrifice in a way that challenges our assumptions about what a hero looks like, the president said. His willingness to honor his fallen brothers so visibly, despite the personal cost, demonstrates a different kind of courage, the courage to remain true to one's principles even when society fails to understand. When the time came for the medal presentation, Marcus walked to the center of the stage with measured steps. The president stood ready with the Medal of Honor, its blue ribbon and gold star representing the highest recognition his country could bestow for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The president began, reading the citation that detailed Marcus's actions during that final mission. The words described his leadership, his refusal to abandon the mission, and his willingness to sacrifice himself to save others. As the president placed the medal around Marcus's neck, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. But what moved Marcus most was seeing Commander Hayes rise from his seat and snap to attention, followed immediately by every other military member in the audience. The salute they rendered was not just for Marcus, but for all veterans who had served with honor and returned home to face challenges that civilians could never fully understand. After the ceremony, Marcus was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, but he found himself seeking out specific people in the crowd. He spent time with Mrs. Henderson and Tommy, thanking them for their early kindness when he had no recognition or status to recommend him. He embraced Bill Henderson and his co-workers, grateful for their acceptance and friendship. Most importantly, he found David Rodriguez and the other veterans who had come to witness the ceremony. "This medal doesn't just belong to me," Marcus told them. "It belongs to every veteran who has struggled to find their place in civilian society, who has been judged by their appearance or their wounds rather than their service." In the months that followed, Marcus's life changed in ways he had never imagined. The Medal of Honor brought opportunities to speak at military academies, veterans organizations, and corporate events about leadership, sacrifice, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. He established a foundation to help veterans with visible disabilities find employment and housing. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Marcus no longer felt the need to hide from society or apologize for his appearance. The tattoo that had once isolated him had become a bridge to help others understand the true cost of military service and the many forms that heroism could take. He still lived modestly, using most of his back pay and speaking fees to fund veteran services. He had purchased a small house in the same neighborhood where he had helped Tommy, wanting to remain connected to the community that had eventually embraced him. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit on his front porch and watch the neighborhood children play in the park, where he had first encountered Tommy and the bullies. Parents would nod respectfully as they passed, their children looking at him with curiosity rather than fear. The same tattoo that had once marked him as an outcast now identified him as someone who had served his country with extraordinary distinction. The coordinates, dates, and symbols were still there, still carrying the same meaning they had always held. But now they also represented something more: the power of staying true to one's values even when the world fails to understand, the importance of honoring sacrifice in whatever way feels authentic, and the reality that heroes come in forms that society doesn't always recognize or appreciate. Marcus had learned that true recognition wasn't about changing who he was to fit society's expectations. It was about society learning to see the heroism that had been there all along, written plainly on his face for anyone willing to look beyond their assumptions and prejudices. The Medal of Honor hadn't made him a hero. It had simply helped the world recognize the hero he had always been.